A billionaire found a girl living in his walls. Her first words left him speechless. He thought he built the safest building in the city until he heard a whisper from behind the vents late one night. When he opened the panel, a terrified woman crawled out, shaking as she begged him not to hurt her. But then she whispered something even more shocking, something that made his entire world turn upside down. She said someone inside his own company told her to hide there because his buildings were being used for something far darker than he ever imagined. Now he's racing to uncover the truth as a hidden network begins closing in to silence her for good. What secret was she running from? And how far will the billionaire go when he realizes the real danger is coming from inside his own walls? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Row Tower, creating a rhythmic backdrop to Mason Rowe's footsteps as he walked the maintenance corridor on the 47th floor. The dim emergency lights cast long shadows across the concrete walls, their industrial glow a stark contrast to the polished luxury of the floors above. Mason's fingers traced along the cool surface of the wall, a habit he'd developed over years of inspecting his buildings. Each texture, each subtle variation in the concrete told him a story about the structure's integrity. His mind wandered to the events earlier that day, when he'd been forced to dismiss his entire security team. Their lackadaisical approach to the building's safety protocols had been unacceptable. Now, in the quiet of the evening, with only a skeleton crew remaining, he found himself alone in this secluded part of his newest skyscraper. The soft patter of rain against the building's exterior usually brought him peace, but tonight something felt different. Wrong. Mason paused mid-stride, his hand still pressed against the wall. There it was again, a faint scraping sound, barely audible over the rain, coming from inside the wall itself. He held his breath, straining to listen. Scratch, scratch. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, human. Mason's heart began to race, but his exterior remained calm as he pulled out his phone. He dialed the number for the security desk, speaking in low, measured tones. "This is Rowe. Send one guard to Maintenance Corridor B, 47th floor. Bring tools. Basic maintenance kit should suffice." The wait felt eternal. Mason stood perfectly still, his palm flat against the wall, feeling for any vibration, any sign of movement within. The scraping continued, growing weaker with each passing minute. When heavy footsteps finally echoed down the corridor, Mason turned to see a young security guard approaching with a toolbox. "Sir." The guard's voice wavered with uncertainty. Mason gestured to the wall. "There's someone inside. We need to remove this vent panel, quickly." The guard's eyes widened, but he moved efficiently, selecting the appropriate tools. The panel was secured with 4 heavy-duty screws, each one taking precious seconds to remove. As the last screw came loose, Mason stepped forward, carefully easing the panel away from the wall. The opening revealed a narrow maintenance shaft, and within it, pressed against the back wall, was a woman. Her dark skin was covered in a layer of grey dust, her clothes torn and dirty. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, locked onto Mason's face. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that looked like desperate hope. "They told me you'd hide me here," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Before Mason could respond, her eyes rolled back, and she began to slump forward. Mason lunged forward, catching her before she could fall. She was light in his arms, too light, and he could feel her bones through her thin clothing. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her skin felt cool to the touch. "The infirmary," Mason ordered, adjusting his hold to support her more securely. "Now." The guard nodded, leading the way as they moved swiftly down the corridor. Mason cradled the unconscious woman carefully, noting how her head lolled against his shoulder, how her fingers clutched weakly at his suit jacket even in unconsciousness. Each step echoed through the empty corridor as they made their way to the private infirmary he'd insisted on including in the building's design. Questions raced through Mason's mind as they walked. Who was she? Who had told her about him? About his building? The woman, Caroline, he would later learn, stirred slightly in his arms, mumbling something incoherent before falling silent again. The guard held doors open as they passed through, their footsteps quickening with urgency. The infirmary was state-of-the-art but small, designed for minor workplace incidents rather than whatever this situation was becoming. Still, it would have to do for now. Mason knew moving her to a hospital without understanding the full situation could put her at risk. As they moved through the building, Mason noticed how the woman in his arms seemed to respond to the changing environments, tensing when they passed through darker areas, relaxing slightly in better-lit spaces. Even unconscious, she appeared acutely aware of her surroundings in a way that spoke of long practice. Her whispered words echoed in his mind. "They told me you'd hide me here." The implications of that statement sent a chill down his spine. Someone had directed her to his building, to him specifically. Someone had known she would need protection, and they had chosen him as her safeguard. Mason looked down at her dust-covered face, noting the slight furrow of her brow even in unconsciousness, the way her fingers remained twisted in the fabric of his jacket, as if afraid to let go. Who was she? And what had she been running from? The guard pushed open the last door, revealing the clean, white interior of the infirmary. Mason moved carefully through the doorway, mindful not to jostle his unconscious charge. The clinical lighting revealed details he hadn't noticed in the dim corridor. Small scratches on her arms, a bruise darkening on her collarbone, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame. "Stay here," Mason instructed the guard as he gently laid Caroline on the examination bed. "Don't let anyone in without my explicit permission, and get me the first aid kit." The guard moved quickly to comply, retrieving the supplies while Mason checked her pulse. It was steady but weak, like a bird's wing fluttering against his fingers. Her breathing had evened out somewhat, but remained shallow. Mason stood beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his mind racing with possibilities and implications. One thing was certain. Finding her was no accident. Someone had orchestrated this meeting, had known exactly where and when to send her. The question was, why? The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but now instead of bringing its usual calm, it seemed to carry a warning. Mason pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, prepared to wait for answers. Whatever storm was coming, he had a feeling this woman was at the center of it, and something deep inside told him he needed to protect her. The morning sun filtered through the infirmary's windows, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Mason shifted in the uncomfortable chair where he'd spent the night, his neck stiff from the awkward position. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had eventually won out. The steady beeping of medical monitors had become a familiar rhythm through the night. A small movement caught his attention. The woman from the wall was stirring, her fingers twitching against the white sheets. When one of the monitors beeped slightly louder, she flinched, her eyes snapping open with sudden alertness. Her gaze darted around the room, taking in every detail with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. Mason remained still, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe here," he said softly, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "This is the private infirmary in Row Tower. I'm Mason Rowe." She watched him carefully, her fingers gripping the sheet tightly. The morning light revealed details that had been hidden in the previous night's darkness. The wariness in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way she positioned herself to keep both him and the door in view. "Can you tell me your name?" Mason asked, maintaining a respectful distance. She swallowed hard, her throat working as if the words were difficult to form. "Caroline," she finally whispered, then added even more quietly. "Caroline Klein." Mason nodded, acknowledging her response without pushing for more. "You need medical attention. Caroline, I'd like to have my private physician examine you, if you'll allow it. No one else will know you're here." Caroline's eyes continued their systematic sweep of the room, pausing briefly on each potential exit. "They said—" she started, then stopped, wetting her dry lips. "They said the Billionaire would hide me. Said your buildings were always safe passageways." Mason leaned forward slightly, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. "Who told you that, Caroline?" Instead of answering, she pressed her lips together, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched the sheet. Mason noticed the signs of severe dehydration, her dry lips, the slight dullness in her eyes, the way her skin seemed to have lost its elasticity. "Let me get you some water," he said, standing slowly. He moved to a small refrigerator in the corner, retrieving a bottle of water. After breaking the seal, he handed it to her, making sure she could take it without their hands touching. Caroline accepted the bottle cautiously, but once she started drinking, her desperation became apparent. Mason had to gently remind her to slow down to prevent sickness. While she sipped the water, he pressed a button to summon his personal physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, who he knew would be discreet. "I'm going to arrange for some breakfast," he told Caroline. "You need proper nutrition. Is there anything you can't eat?" She shook her head slightly, still holding the water bottle like it might be taken away at any moment. Within 15 minutes, a quiet knock announced the arrival of both Dr. Chen and a carefully selected breakfast tray. Dr. Chen's examination was gentle and professional, her movements telegraphed clearly to avoid startling Caroline. The diagnosis confirmed Mason's suspicions: severe dehydration, malnourishment, and various minor injuries that needed attention. Throughout the morning, Mason kept his promise to stay nearby, working quietly on his tablet, while Caroline slowly ate the simple breakfast of oatmeal, toast, and fresh fruit. He noticed how she took small, measured bites, as if unaccustomed to regular meals. "I meant what I said about protecting you," Mason said as she finished eating. "You can stay here as long as you need to. No one will find you." Caroline's eyes met his for a brief moment before dropping back to the tray. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to kindness. The day passed quietly, with Dr. Chen returning periodically to check Caroline's vital signs and administer fluids. Mason arranged for fresh clothes to be brought up and had the adjacent bathroom stocked with basic necessities. Caroline accepted each item with the same careful wariness, but her shoulders gradually relaxed as the hours passed without incident. As evening approached, the building's automatic systems began their routine checks. A standard alarm chimed briefly, testing the emergency protocols. The sound made Caroline jump, her whole body tensing as her eyes darted to the windows. Mason recognized the fear in her expression immediately. "It's just a system test," he explained quickly. "But I can see this isn't the best place for you to rest. I have a quieter suite prepared, away from the building's main systems." Caroline nodded, clearly eager to move away from the clinical setting with its unexpected noises. Mason helped her stand, noting how she swayed slightly but refused any physical support. Her independence, even when weakened, spoke volumes about her past experiences. They walked slowly through the private corridors of Row Tower, Mason deliberately choosing a route with minimal security cameras. Caroline's steps were unsteady but determined, and he noticed how she traced her fingers along the wall as they walked, almost as if she was listening to the building itself. The guest suite was located in a quiet corner of the tower, designed for privacy and comfort. Mason showed Caroline the security features, the reinforced door, the private elevator access, the emergency communication system. She absorbed the information with intense focus, clearly filing away each detail. "No one else has access to this floor," Mason assured her as she explored the space, her movements becoming more confident as she familiarized herself with the layout. "You can rest here safely. I'll be nearby if you need anything." Carolyn stood by the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. "The walls," she said softly, pressing her palm against the cool surface. "They feel different here, quieter." Mason watched her, struck by the odd comment and the way she seemed to be sensing something in the building that he couldn't perceive. There were clearly many layers to Caroline Klein's story, but for now, she needed rest and safety more than she needed questions. "Try to get some sleep," he said, moving toward the door. "If you need anything, just press the intercom button. I'll make sure someone responds immediately." Caroline nodded, still facing the window. As Mason reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Rowe." He turned back to find her watching him, her expression uncertain but determined. "Thank you for believing me." The simple statement carried a weight that Mason felt in his chest. He nodded, understanding that her trust was as fragile as it was precious. "Get some rest, Caroline. You're safe here." The night wrapped Rowe Tower in darkness, broken only by the soft glow of city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside her suite, Caroline tossed restlessly in her sleep, her fingers clutching at the pristine sheets. In her dreams, the walls closed in, and faceless figures moved through hidden passages, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. She woke with a strangled gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sweat dampened her borrowed pajamas as she tried to orient herself in the unfamiliar room. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:15 in the morning, its red numbers casting a faint glow. Caroline slid out of bed, her bare feet silent on the plush carpet. She needed to move, to reassure herself that she wasn't trapped. As she approached the suite's door, she hesitated, unsure if it would be locked from the outside. Her hand trembled as she turned the handle. The door opened smoothly, and there, sitting in a comfortable chair beside the doorway, was Mason Rowe. He looked up from his tablet, his expression gentle but alert despite the late hour. He wore the same clothes from earlier, though slightly rumpled now. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly, setting his tablet aside. Caroline wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she felt. "You stayed. I wanted to make sure you felt secure," Mason explained, his voice low and steady. "Would you like some tea? There's a kitchen down the hall." She nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Following Mason to the small kitchen area, Caroline watched as he prepared 2 mugs of chamomile tea. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if trying not to startle her. They sat at a small table near another wall of windows, the city spread out below them like a blanket of stars. Caroline wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. "The nightmares," she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Take your time," Mason assured her. "We have all night." The sky began to lighten imperceptibly as they sat there, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. Caroline sipped her tea, gathering her courage. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They moved us through your buildings," she said, her eyes fixed on the city below. "Through the walls, the maintenance shafts, the ventilation systems. Places no one would think to look." Mason's hands tightened around his mug, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "Someone had your blueprints," Caroline continued, her voice growing stronger. But they weren't exactly right. There were additional paths, blind spots, places that shouldn't exist but did. She glanced at him briefly before looking away. They called them ghost corridors. Mason's face paled as the implications sank in. His buildings, his designs, had been corrupted into something sinister. "How many?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know for certain. I was moved between 3 different construction sites before—" She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself again. "They said the unfinished buildings were safest. Fewer people, more places to hide us." The sun was rising in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beautiful view seemed at odds with the darkness of Caroline's revelations. "Caroline," Mason said carefully, "I need to know everything. Who did this? How did they get access to my designs?" She began to tremble, her breath coming in short gasps. The mug slipped from her fingers, clattering against the table and spilling tea across its surface. Mason quickly grabbed napkins to clean up the spill, but his attention remained focused on Caroline's distress. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, recognizing he'd pushed too hard. "You don't have to tell me everything right now. You're safe here, and that's what matters most." Caroline's breathing slowly steadied, though her hands continued to shake. "I want to tell you," she said. "I need to tell you, but I—" She pressed her palms against her temples, as if fighting back a headache. "When was the last time you ate?" Mason asked, changing the subject. "The breakfast yesterday," she admitted. Mason nodded, standing slowly. "Then that's what we need to focus on first. Food, rest, and then, when you're stronger, we can talk more." The morning passed quietly. Mason arranged for fresh clothes to be delivered and gave Caroline space to shower and change. He worked from his tablet, making calls only when necessary and keeping his voice low. Caroline dozed on and off on the suite's comfortable couch, her body still recovering from its ordeal. As afternoon approached, Mason noticed Caroline watching him with increasing awareness, her eyes clearer than they'd been since he'd found her. "Would you like to get something to eat?" he asked. "There's a private dining room on this floor, small, secure, just the 2 of us." Caroline considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," she said. I think I'm ready to talk more. After we eat." Mason stood, offering her his hand to help her up. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, her trust in him growing incrementally with each passing hour. As they walked to the dining room, Mason noticed how Caroline's fingers trailed along the wall again, that same listening expression on her face. Whatever secrets his buildings held, whatever horrors had been hidden within their walls, he was determined to uncover the truth. But first, he would make sure Caroline had the strength to tell her story. The private dining room was small but elegant, with another stunning view of the city. As they settled into their seats, Mason could see both determination and apprehension in Caroline's expression. She was ready to share more, but the weight of her experiences still pressed heavily upon her. He would have to balance his need for answers with her need for safety and recovery. The private dining room's soft lighting cast a warm glow across the elegant space. Caroline sat at the polished mahogany table, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her water glass. The lunch spread before them remained mostly untouched: grilled chicken, fresh salads, and warm bread that filled the air with an inviting aroma. Mason noticed Caroline's attention drawn to the wall behind him, where a series of professionally photographed portraits hung in matching silver frames. The executive team of Rowe Enterprises smiled confidently from their positions of power and trust. Caroline's eyes moved from face to face, her expression growing more tense with each photograph she studied. Suddenly, her hand jerked, nearly knocking over her water glass. A small gasp escaped her lips as her gaze fixed on one particular image. Mason turned to follow her line of sight, finding himself looking at the familiar face of Samuel Trent, his chief operating officer and friend of 15 years. "Caroline?" Mason asked gently, noting how the color had drained from her face. "Do you recognize someone?" Her fingers clutched the tablecloth, knuckles white with tension. He was there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Samuel Trent. He gave the orders." She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "About where to keep us, which passages to use, when to move us through the tunnels and shafts." Mason felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. Samuel Trent, the man who had stood beside him at his wife's funeral, who had helped build Rowe Enterprises from the ground up, who had been trusted with every aspect of the company's operations. The same Samuel who had access to every blueprint, every security code, every construction site. "Are you absolutely certain?" Mason asked, his voice hoarse. Caroline nodded, unable to tear her eyes away from the photograph. "His voice," she said. "I would never forget his voice. He would come to check the hidden spaces, speaking quietly to the others about schedules and routes." Her breathing became uneven. "He always wore expensive suits, like in that picture. He smelled like expensive cologne." Mason's mind raced through countless memories: late-night planning sessions, project reviews, casual conversations over drinks. Had there been signs he'd missed? Moments when Samuel's explanations for construction delays or blueprint modifications hadn't quite added up? "I think I need to lie down," Caroline said suddenly, her face ashen. "Please, I can't look at his picture anymore." Mason immediately stood, helping Caroline to her feet. She leaned slightly against him as they walked back to her suite, her steps unsteady. Once inside, she sank onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest in a protective gesture that made her seem smaller, more vulnerable. "You're safe here," Mason assured her, making sure she had water within reach. "I'll have security posted outside your door, people I trust completely." After making sure Caroline was settled, Mason retreated to his private office. His hands shook slightly as he picked up his phone, scrolling to Samuel's number. Each ring seemed to echo in his ears until finally, Samuel's familiar voice answered. "Mason, what can I do for you?" Mason kept his voice carefully neutral. "Samuel, we need to discuss a security situation that arose last night. A young woman was found in one of the maintenance corridors of Rowe Tower." The pause that followed stretched just a fraction too long. In 15 years of friendship, Mason had never known Samuel Trent to be at a loss for words. "That's concerning," Samuel finally responded, his tone perfectly modulated. "Do we know how she gained access?" "We're looking into it," Mason replied, noting the careful way Samuel had avoided asking for specifics about the woman herself. "I'd like you to come in tomorrow morning to review the security protocols." "Of course," Samuel agreed smoothly. "First thing tomorrow." After ending the call, Mason sat in his office, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The city lights began to twinkle on, one by one, but he barely noticed them. His mind kept returning to Caroline's reaction to Samuel's photograph, to the slight tremor in her voice as she described his role in her captivity. As evening settled over the city, Mason found himself walking back to Caroline's suite, needing to check on her, to reassure both her and himself. As he approached, he heard a sharp intake of breath from inside the room. Opening the door, he found Caroline pressed against the far wall, her eyes wide with fear as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "It's just the night security making their rounds," Mason explained softly, closing the door behind him. I promise you no one unauthorized can access this floor." Caroline nodded, but her body remained tense, her gaze fixed on the door. The footsteps passed and faded, but she didn't relax. Mason realized with a sharp pang of guilt that she had spent years learning to fear the sound of approaching footsteps, to associate them with danger and pain. "Would you like me to stay?" he offered, gesturing to the armchair near the door. "I can work from here. Make sure you're not disturbed." Caroline's shoulders lowered slightly, some of the tension leaving her body. "Please," she whispered, sinking onto the couch. "I don't want to be alone right now." Mason settled into the chair, positioning himself between Caroline and the door. He opened his tablet, prepared to spend the evening working while providing the silent reassurance of his presence. The revelation about Samuel had shaken him to his core, but watching Caroline's fearful reactions to ordinary sounds reminded him that his shock and betrayal were nothing compared to what she had endured. As evening settled into night, Mason remained in the armchair, occasionally glancing up from his tablet to check on Caroline. She had curled up on the couch with a blanket, but her eyes stayed open, watching shadows move across the wall from passing cars outside. "The lights help," she said softly, breaking the long silence. In the walls it was always dark. Mason set his tablet aside, giving her his full attention. "Caroline, there's something I need to ask you. When we found you, your first words, you said they told you I would hide you here. What did you mean?" Caroline's fingers tightened around the blanket's edge. The men who moved us, they would laugh sometimes. They'd say, 'The billionaire builds our cages,' and that you'd never notice the extra spaces they added to your buildings." Her voice grew quieter. "They said you were too focused on making everything perfect to question why some areas didn't match the official plans." Mason felt physically ill. His buildings, his life's work, had been twisted into something horrific. "How many?" he asked, dreading the answer. "How many buildings?" "I don't know for certain. They moved us through different places. Sometimes construction sites, sometimes finished buildings." Caroline pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. They had a whole network of hidden paths, places where the walls weren't quite right, where vents led to spaces that shouldn't exist. Mason stood, pacing the room as anger and guilt warred inside him. "I should have seen it. All those small discrepancies in the plans, the unexpected delays." He turned to face Caroline. "I promise you, I'm going to find every single one of those spaces. I'll help you and anyone else they've trapped." "They'll try to stop you," Caroline warned. "Samuel has powerful friends. I don't care what it costs." Mason replied firmly. "My wealth, my reputation, none of that matters compared to making this right." He walked to his briefcase and removed a small device, similar to a smartphone, but with enhanced security features. "This is connected directly to my personal phone," he explained, showing Caroline how to use it. "If you feel unsafe, if anything seems wrong, just press this button. I'll come immediately." Caroline accepted the device, holding it like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me." "Try to get some rest," Mason said gently. "I'll have security right outside, and I'm only an alert away." Leaving Caroline's suite, Mason took the private elevator to his penthouse apartment at the top of Row Tower. The vast space, usually a sanctuary of clean lines and quiet sophistication, felt hollow tonight. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the city lights below, while his reflection stared back, haunted and uncertain. Every building he saw held new meaning now. How many of his other properties had been corrupted? How many people had suffered within walls he'd designed? The weight of it pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Samuel's betrayal cut deep, but the knowledge that his own perfectionism had made him blind to the horror happening inside his buildings was worse. He'd been so focused on creating architectural masterpieces that he'd missed the evil growing within them. As midnight passed, Mason made a decision. His penthouse had state-of-the-art security, and he could protect Caroline better here than in the guest suite. He would move her in the morning, setting up the spare bedroom with everything she needed. Sleep eluded him as he spent hours reviewing building plans on his tablet, seeing them with new eyes. Small inconsistencies he'd previously dismissed now stood out like accusations. When the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, he was already dressed and heading back to Caroline's suite. The security guard straightened as Mason approached. "She's been quiet all night, sir. No disturbances." Mason nodded, waiting until exactly sunrise before knocking gently on Caroline's door. She opened it quickly, already dressed, as if she too had barely slept. "I'd like to move you to my penthouse," he said without preamble. "It's more secure, and I can protect you better there." He paused, realizing how abrupt he sounded. "If you're comfortable with that, of course." Caroline looked back at the suite, then at Mason. "Will I still be able to see the sunrise?" "Yes," he assured her. "The entire east wall is windows." She nodded, gathering the few belongings she had. "I trust you," she said simply, words that felt both like a gift and a heavy responsibility. As they walked to the elevator, Mason knew they were crossing a threshold. The simple act of moving Caroline to his home marked the beginning of something bigger than both of them. A fight that would either expose the darkness in his empire or destroy everything he'd built. But watching Caroline's quiet strength as she stepped into the elevator, Mason knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, driven by the need to right these wrongs and protect those who had been betrayed by his unwitting complicity. The elevator doors opened to Mason's penthouse, revealing a space that defied the cold modernism of most luxury high-rises. Warm beige walls hosted carefully chosen artwork, and plush area rugs softened the natural oak floors. Gentle lighting from alabaster sconces cast a peaceful glow across comfortable furniture, arranged for conversation rather than show. Caroline hesitated at the threshold, her fingers gripping the doorframe. Mason remained still, giving her time to process the new environment. "You can look around first if you'd like," he offered quietly. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes scanning every corner and exit, a habit born of necessity. But something in the space seemed to speak to her, easing the tension in her shoulders ever so slightly. "My wife Sarah chose most of the decor," Mason explained softly. "She believed homes should feel like a warm embrace after a long day." Caroline's gaze settled on a collection of throw pillows arranged on a deep leather sofa. Their hand-embroidered patterns added spots of color to the room. "She had good taste," she whispered. Mason nodded, throat tight with unexpected emotion. "Yes, she did." A gentle knock at the door announced Dolores Vaughan's arrival. The retired social worker entered with the quiet confidence of someone used to navigating delicate situations. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her earth-toned clothing seemed chosen specifically to put others at ease. "Caroline, this is Dolores Vaughan," Mason introduced them. "She's helped many people through difficult times, and I trust her completely." Dolores approached slowly, her warm brown eyes taking in Caroline's defensive posture. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "I brought some chamomile and honey. Always helps settle the nerves." Caroline nodded, and Dolores moved to the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Mason watched as she prepared the tea, noting how she kept her movements deliberate and visible, never making sudden gestures that might startle Caroline. "Mason, would you mind bringing those cushions from the window seat?" Dolores asked, gesturing to the plush pillows that lined the bay window. He gathered them, creating a cozy corner of the sofa, where Caroline could feel protected while still seeing all entrances to the room. As the morning progressed, Mason retreated to a chair near his desk, giving the women space while remaining within sight. Dolores had a way of drawing people out without pushing, filling silence with quiet observations about the weather or commenting on the city view. She offered Caroline small sips of tea, never rushing, never demanding responses. By mid-morning, Caroline's rigid posture had softened slightly. When Dolores mentioned her garden, Caroline's eyes lit up for a moment. "I used to help my grandmother with her flowers," she shared, the words barely above a whisper. "What kind did she grow?" Dolores asked, and for a few precious minutes, Caroline spoke of summer afternoons spent deadheading marigolds and watering tomato plants. Mason's heart ached watching her. In these glimpses of who she had been before, her trauma became even more stark. He found himself gripping his armrest when she would suddenly freeze mid-sentence, her eyes darting to shadows or her body tensing at distant sounds. Around noon, Dolores brought out some paper and pencils. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it's easier to show than tell." She placed them on the coffee table, making no demands. Caroline stared at the supplies for a long moment before reaching for a pencil. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to draw. Rough shapes emerged, hallways, ventilation shafts, hidden rooms that shouldn't exist. Mason recognized elements of his buildings, twisted and altered to serve dark purposes. The maintenance corridors were wider in some places, Caroline explained softly, sketching another layout. They added false walls, spaces between the original design and what people could see. Mason moved closer, studying the drawings. His architect's eye could see how his carefully planned structures had been corrupted, how seemingly minor modifications had created a network of hidden paths through his buildings. As afternoon light slanted through the windows, Caroline's exhaustion became more apparent. Her hands shook more frequently, and her voice grew fainter. Dolores exchanged a look with Mason before gathering the drawings. "I think that's enough for today," she said firmly but kindly. "You need rest, Caroline." Mason led them to the guest room he had prepared. The space was decorated in soothing blues and greens, with blackout curtains that could block all light if desired. A small lamp cast a warm glow, and extra blankets were folded at the foot of the bed. Caroline ran her hand over the soft comforter. "Thank you," she murmured, looking between Mason and Dolores. "I'll be right down the hall if you need anything," Mason assured her. "The security system is active, and no one can access this floor without my authorization." After making sure Caroline was settled, Mason retreated to his private office. Drawings spread across his desk. He pulled up digital blueprints on his multiple monitors. Side by side, the differences became clear. Subtle changes in wall thickness, slight adjustments to ventilation systems, small discrepancies that had seemed insignificant in isolation, but now revealed a sinister pattern. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as he worked, marking each inconsistency with growing horror at the scope of the deception hidden within his life's work. The morning sun cast gentle rays through the penthouse windows as Mason rubbed his tired eyes. He'd spent the entire night studying blueprints, marking discrepancies in red until the pages looked like they were bleeding. Coffee hadn't helped much. His third cup sat cold and forgotten on his desk. A soft knock drew his attention. Dolores stood in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Caroline's awake. I've got breakfast ready in the kitchen." Mason nodded, gathering his scattered thoughts. "How is she this morning?" "Calmer. Amazing what a good night's sleep in a safe place can do." In the kitchen, Caroline sat at the counter, wrapped in a borrowed sweater that seemed too big for her thin frame. Steam rose from a bowl of oatmeal in front of her, topped with fresh berries and honey. Her hands cupped a mug of tea, drawing warmth from it. "Good morning," Mason said softly, keeping his movements slow and predictable as he approached. "Did you sleep okay?" Caroline nodded, taking a small sip of tea. "Better than I have in a long time." Her voice was stronger today, though still quiet. As Mason settled with his own breakfast, Caroline's eyes drifted to the building plans scattered across the nearby dining table. "You were looking at the blueprints all night, trying to understand how they did this without me noticing." Mason's frustration was evident in his voice. Caroline set down her mug carefully. I might be able to help, with finding the hidden spaces." She paused, gathering courage. "I learned to listen to the buildings. It's how I stayed alive." Dolores leaned forward, interest sparking in her eyes. "What do you mean by listen, honey?" "It's hard to explain." Caroline's fingers traced patterns on her mug. "Buildings. They talk, in a way. Air moves differently through hidden spaces. Footsteps echo differently in false walls. When you're trapped long enough, you start to notice patterns." Mason straightened, his architect's mind racing. "You can detect structural anomalies through sound and vibration?" Caroline nodded. "And air pressure. Temperature changes. Little things most people wouldn't notice." She glanced down. "You probably think I'm crazy." "Not at all," Mason said firmly. "Would you be willing to demonstrate?" After receiving Caroline's hesitant nod, Mason moved to his tablet, pulling up the building's environmental controls. "I'm going to activate different ventilation zones. Tell me what you notice." He started with a subtle adjustment to the kitchen's air circulation. Caroline's head tilted slightly, like a bird listening to distant music. "There's new airflow behind that wall." She pointed without looking. "It splits into two paths. One goes up, the other angles east." Mason checked the system diagram. She was exactly right. He tried several more tests, different zones, various intensities. Each time, Caroline identified the location and direction with uncanny precision. She even noted when air pressure changed in sealed spaces that shouldn't have been detectable. Dolores watched with growing amazement. "Good Lord," she whispered. "You developed this skill while hiding?" Caroline's shoulders hunched slightly. "Had to. The wrong sound, the wrong vibration. It could mean they were coming. But if I paid attention, I could usually find safe places to hide." Mason pulled up digital layouts of several incomplete row properties on his laptop. "Could you look at these? Tell me if anything seems wrong." Caroline studied the screens intently. Her finger traced along certain walls, pausing at intersections. "This section here, the walls would hum wrong. There's too much space between these points." She indicated several areas where Mason had already noted suspicious modifications. "And here," she continued, pointing to another blueprint. "This shaft is marked as electrical, but it's too wide. They probably added a false panel to create a passage." For the next hour, Caroline identified potential hidden spaces in building after building. Her insights matched patterns Mason had begun to suspect, but she found several he'd missed entirely. Dolores, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "This is incredible, Carolyn. And terrible. But we need to be careful here." She looked at Mason. "Intuition and experience, no matter how accurate, won't be enough for authorities. We need concrete evidence." Mason nodded grimly. "You're right." He studied one particular blueprint, a tower still under construction across town. We need to verify these modifications physically. He turned to Caroline. Would you be willing to look at one of these buildings with me? Not tonight, but soon. Caroline's hands twisted in her lap. You want to check in person? Only when you're ready. Mason assured her. And I'll be with you, the whole time. We'll go at night when the site is empty. After a long moment, Caroline nodded. I can do it. I need to do it. They spent the afternoon planning. Mason gathered equipment, flashlights, tablets with building plans, tools for accessing maintenance panels. He arranged for private security he trusted to sweep and secure the site in advance. As twilight approached, Mason checked his gear one final time. Caroline watched from the doorway of his office, anxiety evident in her posture. You'll come back? The question was barely audible. Mason met her eyes steadily. I promise. Dolores will stay with you, and I'll return as soon as I've verified the site is secure for our visit. Be careful, Caroline whispered. They don't like people finding their secrets. I will. Mason shouldered his bag, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Try to rest. Tomorrow we start gathering real evidence. The setting sun painted the city in shades of orange and purple as Mason prepared to leave. Behind him, Caroline stood in the warm light of the penthouse, Dolores's steadying hand on her shoulder. Their shadows stretched long across the floor, a reminder of how far they'd come since finding Caroline in that wall, and how far they still had to go to uncover the full truth. The night air felt heavy with anticipation as Mason's private car pulled up to Row Annex at 11:30. Streetlights cast long shadows across the chain-link fence surrounding the construction site. Caroline tugged nervously at the hood of her borrowed sweatshirt, the security badge clipped to its front catching the dim light. Remember, Mason said softly. My most trusted security team has already swept the site. We're alone here. He touched her shoulder gently. But if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately. Caroline nodded, pulling the hood lower over her face. They crossed the empty parking lot, their footsteps crunching on scattered gravel. Mason used his master key card to unlock the temporary entrance door, and they slipped inside. The unfinished building felt alive with tiny sounds, the hum of temporary power units, the whisper of tarps moving in air currents, the settling of new concrete and steel. Caroline tilted her head, listening intently as Mason clicked on his flashlight. This way, she whispered, moving with surprising confidence through the shadowy space. Her fingers trailed along rough drywall as she walked, like reading Braille. The air moves differently around the corner. They passed stacks of building materials and tool carts, their shadows dancing in Mason's careful sweeps of light. Caroline led them up a temporary stairwell to the third floor, where sheets of plastic still covered window openings, rippling in the night breeze. Here. Caroline stopped abruptly, pressing her palm against a seemingly ordinary wall section. Listen. Mason stood perfectly still. At first he heard nothing but the usual construction site sounds. Then he noticed it. A subtle difference in the way air moved through this section, like a whispered breath behind the drywall. This isn't right, he murmured, consulting the blueprint on his tablet. There shouldn't be any void space here. Using a small pry bar from his bag, Mason carefully worked at the edge of a wall panel. It came loose with surprising ease, revealing a dark space behind. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow crawl space that stretched away into shadow. Oh, God, Caroline breathed, taking an involuntary step back. Just like the others. Mason documented the hidden space with his phone camera before stepping closer. The beam of his light revealed items scattered on the floor, A stack of blankets pushed against one wall, empty water bottles, food wrappers from cheap snacks. A small length of chain lay coiled in one corner, its links glinting dully in the flashlight beam. Caroline's breathing became shallow and quick. Mason immediately moved between her and the disturbing scene. "Stay with me," he said quietly. "You're safe. We just need to document everything." His phone clicked repeatedly as he photographed the evidence. In a corner, partially hidden under debris, he found a stack of badges, security clearances that looked genuine at first glance, but were clearly forged. Beneath them lay a sheet of paper covered in coded instructions, lines of numbers and letters that made no obvious sense. A sudden echoing clang from somewhere in the building made them both freeze. Caroline's hand clutched Mason's arm, her fingers digging in through his jacket sleeve. They held their breath, listening intently. "This way," Caroline mouthed, pulling him toward a collection of large pipes running floor to ceiling. They pressed themselves behind the pipes, Mason clicking off his flashlight. In the darkness, Caroline's quick breathing seemed impossibly loud. Minutes ticked by. Finally, Caroline relaxed slightly. "Just the building settling," she whispered. "The new concrete makes that sound sometimes when it cools at night." They emerged from their hiding place cautiously. Mason quickly finished photographing the remaining evidence, while Caroline stood watch, her head cocked, to catch any new sounds. When he was done, they carefully replaced the wall panel, leaving no sign of their discovery. The journey back through the building felt endless, every shadow seeming to hide potential threats. But Caroline's extraordinary awareness guided them safely. As they finally stepped outside, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, the first hint of dawn touching the horizon. The drive back to Row Tower was silent, both of them processing what they'd found. When they reached Mason's penthouse, the sun was just cresting the city skyline, painting the windows in pale gold. They practically stumbled to the couch, the night's tension finally draining away. Caroline curled into the corner of the soft leather sofa, drawing her knees up to her chest. The borrowed hoodie swallowed her small frame, making her look even more vulnerable. Mason sat heavily beside her, his phone heavy in his pocket with its damning evidence. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warming their faces. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the peaceful morning light wash over them, a sharp contrast to the darkness they'd just witnessed. "We did it," Caroline finally whispered, her voice carrying equal parts exhaustion and triumph. "We found proof." Mason nodded, watching dust motes dance in the golden sunbeams. "Yes," he said softly. "Now we can start making things right." They sat together in the strengthening morning light, two unlikely allies united by their discovery. The weight of what they'd found, and what it meant, settled around them like a heavy blanket. But with it came the first real hope of exposing the truth and stopping those responsible. The late morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows as Mason and Caroline waited for Detective Ana Rios to arrive. They had managed a few hours of fitful rest after their nighttime discovery, but tension still hummed in the air. Caroline sat quietly on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that Dolores had prepared to calm her nerves. The elevator chimed, and Detective Rios strode into the penthouse, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She carried herself with professional authority, her dark suit crisp despite the early hour. Mason met her at the entrance, holding up his phone with the documented evidence. "Detective, thank you for coming so quickly," Mason said, his voice low but urgent. Rios's expression remained neutral as she studied the photos on Mason's phone. Her eyebrows drew together slightly as she swiped through image after image. "Mr. Rowe, these are serious implications. You understand I'll need more than just photos to pursue this." Caroline stood slowly from the couch, drawing the detective's attention. Though her voice was quiet, it carried clearly across the room. "I can tell you everything. Every building, every hidden space they used." Detective Rios's skepticism was evident in her stance, but she sat down across from Caroline, pulling out her notebook. "All right, Miss Klein, start from the beginning." For the next 2 hours, Carolyn spoke steadily, describing the network of secret spaces with remarkable detail. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, supported by Dolores's gentle presence beside her. Mason watched as Rios's professional skepticism gradually transformed into focused attention, her pen moving rapidly across the pages of her notebook. "The badges we found," Caroline explained, indicating the forged security passes in the evidence bag. "They used these to move freely through construction sites, and the coded messages? They changed them weekly, but they always followed the same pattern." Rio studied the paper with the coded instructions, her expression hardening. "This matches patterns we've seen in other trafficking cases. The detail you've provided about the locations, the timing of movements, it fits with our existing intelligence." For the first time since Mason had found her, Caroline smiled. It was faint, just a slight upward curve of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. The relief of being believed seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders. "We'll need to move carefully on this," Rios said, gathering her evidence bags. "These people have resources, connections. We'll start official proceedings, but discreetly. Mr. Rowe, I'll need access to all your building plans, especially the ones Samuel Trent handled directly." Mason nodded firmly. "Whatever you need, Detective. My entire organization is at your disposal." As afternoon mellowed into evening, the atmosphere in the penthouse began to shift. The initial tension of the morning gave way to something softer, more hopeful. Mason found himself in the kitchen, pulling out ingredients his hands remembered but his mind had forgotten. His wife's recipe for chicken piccata, simple but comforting, had always been their Friday night tradition. "Can I help?" Carolyn asked quietly, appearing at the kitchen entrance. She looked steadier now, more present than she had in days. Mason smiled, handing her a lemon to zest. "Sarah, my wife. She always said cooking was better with company." Together they worked in comfortable silence, the kitchen filling with warm aromas. Dolores set the table while Detective Rios finished her final notes, having decided to stay when Mason extended the dinner invitation. The meal was simple, but brought them together in a way that felt significant. Carolyn took small, careful bites, savoring each one as if remembering how to enjoy food again. Detective Rios relaxed her professional demeanor slightly, sharing stories about successful cases that had seemed impossible at first. Dolores offered quiet words of encouragement, her presence a steady anchor for them all. As night settled over the city, Mason saw his guests out, thanking Detective Rios once more for her support. Dolores hugged Carolyn gently before leaving, promising to return in the morning. The penthouse grew quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the building's systems. Mason stepped out onto his balcony, letting the cool night air clear his mind. The city stretched out below, a tapestry of lights and shadows. He thought about his buildings, how they could be transformed from hiding places of horror into true sanctuaries. The future seemed to hold possibility again, a chance to rebuild with the integrity he'd always intended. After several minutes of reflection, Mason headed back inside to check on Caroline one last time before retiring. He knocked softly on her door, but there was no response. When he opened it, his heart stopped. The room was empty. The curtains billowed inward from the open window, dancing in the night, breeze like pale ghosts. Caroline was gone. The bedside lamp cast a warm glow over the untouched covers, and a chill breeze stirred the papers on the nightstand. Mason rushed to the window, his hands gripping the sill as he stared out into the darkness, his mind racing with fear and confusion. The city lights blurred below, offering no clue to where she might have gone. Mason's hands trembled as he sprinted through the penthouse, his footsteps echoing off the walls. "Caroline!" His voice cracked with desperation. "Caroline, where are you?" He checked every room, throwing open doors and searching closets. The kitchen stood empty, dishes from their hopeful dinner still drying in the rack. The living room remained undisturbed, Caroline's sketches of building layouts scattered across the coffee table. His home office was dark and silent. With shaking fingers, Mason pulled out his phone and activated the emergency alert on the security device he'd given Caroline. The screen showed no response, just an endless loading symbol that made his stomach twist. He ran back to her room, studying the billowing curtains more carefully now. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence she had climbed out herself. The window wasn't broken. It had been opened from the inside. His phone vibrated in his hand, making him jump. A text message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You should have left the walls alone." Mason's blood ran cold. Samuel. It had to be. He hit Detective Rios's number on speed dial, pacing as the phone rang. "Detective," he said the moment she answered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Caroline's gone. Someone took her from the penthouse." "I'm 10 minutes away." Rios responded without hesitation. "Don't touch anything else in her room. Lock down the building." Mason immediately called security, ordering a complete lockdown of Row Tower. His heart pounded as he waited for Rios, every minute feeling like an hour. When she finally arrived, her face was grim and focused. "Show me the security feeds," she demanded, already pulling out her notebook. They hurried to Mason's office where he accessed the building's surveillance system. His fingers flew over the keyboard, rewinding footage from multiple cameras. "There," he said, pointing to a screen showing the service elevator at 7:15 p.m. They watched as two masked men in maintenance uniforms emerged from the elevator. The footage showed them using a master key card to access the restricted floor, moving with practiced efficiency through the hallways. Minutes later, they reappeared carrying Caroline, who appeared unconscious. "The elevator override," Mason muttered, pulling up the access logs. "Only 5 people have that level of clearance, including me and—" His voice trailed off as he saw Samuel Trent's security code highlighted in the system. Detective Rios leaned closer to the screen, her expression hardening. "We've got him. That's his personal override code, clear as day. This is the evidence we needed to move on him directly." But Mason barely heard her. All he could see was Caroline being carried away, limp and helpless, while he had been standing on his balcony just rooms away, lost in thoughts about the future. The weight of his failure crashed over him like a wave. He stumbled to the penthouse steps and sank down, putting his head in his hands. "I promised to protect her," he whispered. "I promised she'd be safe here." Rios crouched beside him, her voice firm but gentle. "This isn't over, Mason. I'm calling in every available unit. We'll have tactical teams ready within the hour. Samuel may have high-level access, but he's still leaving trails. No one can move in this city without being seen." She pulled out her phone, barking orders to her team. "I want every camera in a 10-mile radius checked. Traffic cams, ATMs, store security, all of it. And get me blueprints of every row property under construction. If they're using the same network Caroline described, they'll need somewhere to hide her." Mason lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed but focused. "I should have seen it. All these years, Samuel was right beside me, using my buildings, my trust." His voice broke. "How many others suffered because I was blind?" "Stop," Rios commanded. "Guilt doesn't help Caroline right now. I need you clear-headed. You know these buildings better than anyone. Help me think. Where would Samuel take her?" But Mason couldn't concentrate. The image of Caroline's empty room kept flashing through his mind. the curtains moving in the wind, the untouched bed. The dinner dishes still warm in the kitchen, all the small signs of the trust he'd broken. As night settled fully over the city, Rios coordinated with her teams from Mason's office. Reports came in steadily. Possible sightings, security footage being analyzed, checkpoints being established. But nothing concrete yet, nothing that led them to Caroline. Mason stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering cityscape. Each light represented a window, a room, a potential hiding place. Somewhere out there, Caroline was being held in another secret space, another shadow in his architectural empire that he had failed to see. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface. "I will find you," he whispered into the darkness, the words both a prayer and a promise. "Whatever it takes, Caroline, I will find you." Behind him, Rios's phone buzzed with another update. Teams were mobilizing across the city. But Mason remained at the window, sleepless and haunted, watching the lights below blur through tears of frustration and determination. The night stretched endlessly ahead, each moment taking Caroline further away, each second a reminder of his failure to keep her safe. The device he'd given her sat silent on his desk, its emergency alert still unanswered. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that somewhere in its maze of streets and buildings, a woman who had finally begun to trust again was once more trapped in darkness. The morning sun crept across Mason's penthouse living room, illuminating scattered blueprints that covered every surface. Papers rustled beneath his restless feet as he paced, stopping occasionally to study a drawing before moving on, his movements mechanical and purposeless. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night spent searching for answers that refused to come. Dolores Vaughan stepped out of the elevator at 7:15 in the morning, her practical shoes quiet on the marble floor. She found Mason standing motionless by the window, surrounded by the chaos of unfolded maps and building plans. His shoulders were slumped, defeat written in every line of his body. "Mason," she called softly, setting her worn leather bag on a chair. "Have you slept at all?" He turned slowly, his eyes red-rimmed and distant. "I keep seeing her face, Dolores, the trust in her eyes when she finally felt safe here." His voice cracked. "I failed her, just like I failed to see what Samuel was doing all these years." Dolores crossed the room, carefully stepping over blueprints. She took Mason's cold hands in her warm ones, forcing him to focus on her. "Sit down before you fall down," she ordered gently, leading him to the couch. "When's the last time you ate something?" Mason shook his head, sinking onto the cushions. "It doesn't matter. Nothing matters except finding her." He picked up a nearby blueprint, his fingers tracing the lines with desperate intensity. "Every minute we waste, they could be moving her further away, through more hidden spaces I should have known about." "Stop that right now," Dolores said firmly, taking the paper from his hands. "This guilt you're carrying isn't helping Caroline. You need to think clearly." But Mason wasn't listening. He stared at his empty hands, his voice hollow. "I promised to protect her, Dolores. She survived so much, found the courage to trust again, and I let her be taken right out of my home." Dolores sat beside him, her presence steady and grounding. "Your wife Sarah used to tell me something that stuck with me," she said quietly. "She believed a broken heart could still build something good. That pain could become purpose if we let it." Mason's breath caught at the mention of Sarah's name. "She always saw the best in everything," he whispered. Even at the end, she kept talking about future projects, about making spaces that would help people heal. And she was right. Dolores pressed gently. "Mason, this is your second chance, not just to save Caroline, but to reclaim your work, to turn what was broken into something healing. She squeezed his hand. Sarah would want you to fight, not drown in guilt. Tears filled Mason's eyes, spilling over before he could stop them. Dolores pulled him into a motherly embrace, letting him release the pain and fear he'd been holding back. For several minutes, the only sound was his muffled crying and Dolores's soft humming, a melody she often used to comfort traumatized survivors. When Mason finally pulled back, his eyes were clearer, more focused. He wiped his face with his sleeve, looking around at the scattered blueprints with new purpose. "You're right," he said, his voice stronger. "Sarah would tell me to get up and do something." He stood, gathering several older building plans from the floor. Spreading them on the coffee table, he began studying them with renewed concentration. Dolores watched as his architect's mind engaged, noting how his fingers traced certain pathways repeatedly. "There's a pattern," he muttered, pulling more blueprints closer. "Look at these older structures, built 15 to 20 years ago. The maintenance layouts are different. More access points, larger service areas." He grabbed a marker, circling similar features across multiple plans. "These are the buildings Caroline described, where they moved people through the walls." Dolores leaned in, following his markings. "They used your older designs because the newer security systems would have caught them." Mason nodded, excitement building in his voice. "Exactly. And Caroline said she learned to listen to the buildings in places like this." He pointed to a service corridor diagram. "These older ventilation systems create distinct sound patterns. That's how she knew where to hide, how to predict movement." The day passed in a blur of focused activity. Mason and Dolores reviewed dozens of buildings, mapping potential routes and hidden spaces. As evening approached, Mason gathered the most promising plans, rolling them carefully into tubes. "We need to go there," he said, grabbing his keys. "The first row building I ever designed. It has the same layout Caroline described, and it's close to where we found evidence in that crawl space." Dolores nodded, gathering her things. "I'm coming with you. You shouldn't do this alone." They drove through the darkening city, street lights flickering on as the sun set. The old row building stood quietly in the business district, its classic lines a stark contrast to Mason's newer, sleeker towers. Using his master key, they entered through a service entrance, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Mason led them to a dark maintenance hallway, similar to where he'd first found Caroline. The walls hummed softly with ancient ventilation systems, pipes carrying water and air through the building's bones. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, placing one hand against the cool concrete. "This is where I need to start," he whispered. "Caroline survived by listening to the buildings. If I want to find her, I need to learn what she heard." Closing his eyes, Mason pressed his ear to the wall. The vibrations traveled through his body. Distant fans, water flowing through pipes, the subtle shifting of the structure itself. Somewhere in this symphony of sounds were the clues Caroline had learned to read, the whispers that had kept her alive. He stood there in the darkness, listening deeply, letting the building speak to him in ways he'd never understood before. Dolores watched silently, her heart aching for both the man before her and the woman they hoped to save. The building's nighttime silence wrapped around Mason like a heavy blanket. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor as he walked the empty corridors, hands trailing along the cold metal walls. The emergency lights cast long shadows, making the familiar space feel alien and mysterious. He stopped at a junction, remembering how Caroline had demonstrated her technique earlier. "Listen with your whole body," she'd said, tapping her fingers in a gentle pattern against the wall. "The building speaks if you know how to hear it." Mason closed his eyes, pressing both palms flat against the cool surface. At first, he heard only the usual sounds, the whisper of air through vents, the distant hum of machinery. But then, something else caught his attention. A faint, rhythmic tapping, barely louder than his own heartbeat. Tap, 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 tap. His eyes snapped open. The pattern was deliberate, not the random settling of an old building. Moving slowly down the hallway, he followed the sound, stopping every few feet to listen again. The tapping grew slightly stronger as he approached a sealed maintenance hatch. Mason's hands trembled as he examined the hatch's edges. It wasn't on any of his current blueprints, but the wear patterns around the seal suggested frequent use. The tapping continued, drawing him further into the building's maze-like service areas. Following the sound led him to a narrow corridor he'd never noticed before. The space felt wrong, too tight, too hidden. Another access point caught his eye, this one partially concealed behind a false electrical panel. The tapping echoed more clearly here. With shaking fingers, Mason pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Rios's number. She answered on the second ring. "Rios," he whispered. "I'm at the old row building on 7th Street. I think I've found something. Get here as fast as you can." "Don't do anything stupid, Mason," she warned. "Wait for backup." "Just hurry." He ended the call, knowing he couldn't wait. If Caroline was behind that hatch, every minute mattered. Using a multi-tool from his pocket, Mason worked at the hatch's edges. The metal groaned in protest, but finally gave way with a dull pop. A shaft stretched below him, maintenance ladder rungs disappearing into darkness. The tapping echoed up from somewhere beneath. Taking a deep breath, Mason swung his legs into the opening. The ladder felt solid enough under his hands as he began his descent. The shaft closed around him, tight and confining. His expensive suit caught on rough edges, but he barely noticed. All his focus was on the sound growing stronger with each careful step down. Tap, 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 tap. 20 feet down, maybe 30. It was hard to judge in the dim light. The tapping grew more distinct. Mason paused, listening intently. Yes, there was a pattern he recognized. It was similar to what Caroline had shown him, but weaker, as if made by exhausted hands. A horizontal duct branched off from the main shaft. Mason eased himself into it, having to crawl on hands and knees. The space was barely large enough for his broad shoulders. Sweat trickled down his back as he inched forward, following the sound. After what felt like an eternity, the duct opened into a hidden chamber. Mason's heart nearly stopped when his flashlight beam revealed Caroline. She was bound to a support pillar, zip ties cutting into her wrists. Her face was pale but determined, and she was still tapping, hitting the metal pillar with her bound hands to create the sound that had led him here. The chamber was filled with boxes and equipment. Mason's stomach turned as he recognized items meant for controlling and transporting people, restraints, sedatives, forged documents. This was proof of everything Caroline had described, a staging area for their operation. "Caroline," he whispered, moving toward her. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out." Before he could reach her, a sound behind him made him freeze. A click, followed by heavy footsteps. Mason turned slowly, his body automatically positioning itself between Caroline and the chamber entrance. Samuel Trent stood there, flanked by two large men Mason didn't recognize. His old friend's familiar face was twisted into something cold and foreign, his usual warmth replaced by calculating menace. "I truly hoped you'd let this go, Mason," Samuel said softly. "You could have just kept building, kept looking the other way. But you had to play hero, didn't you?" Mason planted his feet firmly, hands clenching into fists. Everything he'd built, every friendship he'd trusted, had been corrupted by the man standing before him. But he wouldn't let them hurt Caroline again. Not while he could still stand. "It's over, Samuel," Mason said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You're not touching her again." The chamber's dim light cast harsh shadows across Samuel's face as he took a step forward, his two accomplices moving to flank Mason. In the tense silence, Carolyn's soft tapping had finally stopped, replaced by the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. Mason stood his ground, muscles tense, ready to fight. He might not be trained for combat, but he had something stronger driving him, the need to protect someone vulnerable, to finally make right what his negligence had allowed to happen. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. A broken heart can still build something good. He wouldn't break his promise again. The confined chamber seemed to shrink even further as Samuel stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing against the concrete floor. The dim emergency lighting cast an eerie glow across his face, transforming Mason's old friend into someone unrecognizable. "You know what's truly ironic, Mason?" Samuel's voice dripped with condescension. "You built the perfect empire for us. Every building, every design, they were all just waiting to be modified. The Great Mason Row, creating the perfect network of hidden spaces without even knowing it." Mason's hand brushed against a control panel on the wall behind him, and his architectural mind instantly recognized its purpose. Years of designing these systems flashed through his thoughts. He kept his eyes locked on Samuel, not wanting to draw attention to his discovery. "All those years, Samuel," Mason said, his voice tight with anger. "I trusted you. We built this company together." Samuel laughed, the sound hollow and cold. "And look how beautifully it worked. Your obsession with innovative design gave us exactly what we needed. Those maintenance corridors, those green energy spaces, perfect hiding spots, perfect trafficking routes." The two accomplices shifted their weight, moving to circle around Mason. He could feel Caroline trembling behind him, still bound to the pillar. His fingers traced the edge of the control panel, finding the emergency override sequence he'd designed himself. "You're wrong about one thing," Mason said quietly. "I didn't build this empire for you. I built it to help people." In one fluid motion, Mason punched in the sequence. The fire suppression system engaged with a deafening hiss. Dense steam erupted from ceiling vents, instantly filling the chamber with a blinding white cloud. The accomplices stumbled backward, cursing and shielding their eyes. Mason spun around, pulling a small blade from his pocket to cut Caroline's restraints. "Hold on to me," he whispered urgently. "Remember how you taught me about the airflow? We're going to use that now." Caroline's fingers gripped his sleeve as Mason guided her toward a maintenance corridor he knew ran parallel to the main shaft. Behind them, Samuel's angry shouts echoed through the steam. "Find them! Don't let them reach the upper levels!" Mason and Caroline moved as quickly as they could through the narrow passage. Her earlier descriptions of air patterns helped them navigate. They could feel the subtle current of ventilation pulling toward the building's core. Caroline's breathing was labored, but she kept pace, her survival instincts driving her forward. "There's a pressure seal system ahead," Mason explained between breaths. "Part of the building's emergency containment design, if we can get through it." Heavy footsteps pounded behind them. Samuel's voice rang out, closer than expected. "You can't hide in your own building, Mason. I know these paths as well as you do." They reached a junction where 3 corridors met. Mason pulled Caroline toward a sealed doorway, quickly entering an access code. The heavy door slid open with a hydraulic whine. "Get through," he urged her. "I need 10 seconds." As Caroline slipped through the doorway, Mason turned to face the approaching footsteps. Samuel emerged from the steam first, his expensive suit now disheveled, his face contorted with rage. He lunged forward just as Mason slammed his palm against the emergency lockdown panel. The pressure seal doors activated instantly, heavy metal barriers dropping from the ceiling. Samuel's eyes widened in realization, a moment too late. He threw himself forward, but the barriers sealed with a decisive thunk, trapping him in the chamber between sections. Mason backed through the doorway where Caroline waited, his heart pounding. Through the reinforced window, he could see Samuel pounding against the barrier, his muffled shouts barely audible through the thick metal. Above them, the building came alive with the sound of approaching authorities. Detective Rios's voice carried down the main shaft, commanding officers to secure the lower levels. The backup she'd promised had arrived. Caroline's legs finally gave out. Mason caught her as she collapsed, gathering her gently in his arms. Her body shook with exhaustion and relief as officers and detectives swarmed into the corridor, weapons drawn. Detective Rios appeared, immediately calling for paramedics. "You found her," Rios said, her professional demeanor softening as she took in Caroline's condition. "We've got Samuel's accomplices in custody upstairs. They tried to run when they heard our sirens." Through the window, they could see other officers securing Samuel, who had gone eerily quiet, his empire crumbling around him. The sound of approaching paramedic teams echoed through the building. Caroline stirred in Mason's arms, her voice barely a whisper. I knew you would hear me." Her fingers weakly squeezed his hand. "You learned to listen, just like I taught you." Mason held her carefully as the paramedics arrived with a stretcher, their efficient movements filling the corridor. The nightmare was over, brought down by the very buildings that had once hidden it, and by a woman brave enough to teach a builder how to truly listen to his creations. The private recovery suite at St. Mary's Hospital felt worlds away from the cold maintenance tunnels where they'd found Caroline. Mason had specifically chosen this room for its large windows and peaceful garden view, wanting to surround her with warmth and light after so much darkness. Soft morning sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains as medical equipment hummed quietly in the background. Caroline lay propped up against crisp white pillows, her face still bearing traces of exhaustion but showing small signs of improvement each day. Mason hadn't left the hospital since they'd arrived, sleeping in the cushioned chair beside her bed and working remotely when needed. "The sunrise looks different from up here," Caroline whispered on their third morning, her voice growing stronger. "I forgot what it felt like to watch light move across walls without being afraid." Mason looked up from his laptop, setting it aside immediately. These moments when she spoke freely were precious, and he'd learned to give them his full attention. "This room is yours as long as you need it," he assured her. "No one can reach this floor without proper clearance." Dolores arrived each morning like clockwork, her warm presence filling the room with gentle strength. She would settle into the chair opposite Mason, pull out her well-worn Bible, and begin reading in her rich, soothing voice. The familiar verses seemed to wash over Caroline like a healing balm. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." Dolores read one afternoon, her voice steady and sure. "Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Caroline's fingers would often grip the blanket during these readings, but not from fear, from something that looked more like hope. Mason watched as day by day, scripture by scripture, she began to relax into the words, letting them fill the spaces where fear had lived for so long. As the week progressed, Caroline's physical strength began returning. The doctors were pleased with her recovery, though they insisted on maintaining the private security Mason had arranged. During their daily check-ins, Caroline started sharing more of herself, not just the survivor, but the person she'd been before, and the person she hoped to become. "I used to dream about designing gardens," she confided one afternoon, picking at the edge of her blanket. "Places where everything grows wild but beautiful, where people could feel safe, even in the open air." Mason leaned forward, encouraging her to continue. "What kind of gardens?" "Healing gardens." she said softly, with tall trees for shade and lots of hiding places, but all of them peaceful ones. Places where you could hear wind in the leaves instead of... She trailed off, but Mason understood. Maybe we could design one together, he suggested carefully. When you're stronger, something for other survivors. Her eyes lit up at this, showing a spark of the passionate person who existed beneath the trauma. These conversations became their daily ritual, sharing dreams, rebuilding trust, and slowly defining what home could mean after everything that had happened. Detective Rios visited regularly with updates on the investigation. Each piece of information Caroline had provided was leading them to more victims, more hidden spaces, more evidence of Samuel's extensive network. Mason would watch Caroline's face carefully during these briefings, ready to end them if they became too overwhelming, but she insisted on hearing everything. Your knowledge of the building systems helped us locate 3 more survivors yesterday, Rios reported one afternoon. They're safe now, receiving medical care. You've given so many people their lives back, Caroline. Tears slid silently down Caroline's cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Are they going to be okay? Thanks to you, yes, Rios assured her. Each one of them will have access to the same resources and protection you have. They're going to make it. The days fell into a gentle rhythm. Mornings with Dolores and her scripture readings, afternoons filled with quiet conversations and careful hope, evenings watching the sun paint the sky in colors Caroline was learning to enjoy again. Mason worked from his chair, only leaving for absolute necessities, and always making sure either Dolores or a trusted security team was present. One particularly beautiful evening, as the sunset turned the hospital room golden, Mason stepped out onto the small private balcony to take an important call from Detective Rios. The air was warm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the garden below. We've done it, Mason, Rios said, her voice triumphant but tired. Samuel's entire network. We've mapped and dismantled all of it. The last safe house was raided this morning. It's over. Mason gripped the balcony railing, letting the news wash over him. Every location? Every accomplice? Every single one, Rios confirmed. The evidence Caroline provided, combined with what we found in those maintenance tunnels, it gave us everything we needed. Samuel's going away for life, and he's taking everyone involved with him. Thank you, Mason said quietly, emotion thick in his voice, for believing us, for helping us end this. Thank Caroline, Rios replied. She's the hero in this story. After ending the call, Mason took a moment to compose himself, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the city in shades of pink and gold. When he turned to go back inside, he paused in the doorway, struck by the sight before him. Caroline was awake, propped up against her pillows. The sunset bathed her face in warm light, and for the first time since he'd found her behind that wall, she was smiling, really smiling. It transformed her entire face, showing glimpses of the person she might have been before trauma tried to break her, and hints of the strong woman she was becoming. Good news? She asked softly, noticing his expression. Mason moved back to his chair, his own smile matching hers. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, marking moments in this new chapter of healing and hope. It wasn't just good news he had to share, it was the best possible news for someone who had lived so long in fear. Samuel's network was finished, dismantled completely, unable to hurt anyone else ever again. And here was Caroline, growing stronger each day, ready to hear it. The golden light filled the room with warmth as Mason prepared to tell her that finally, truly, she was free. The morning Caroline was discharged from the hospital dawned clear and bright, a gentle breeze carrying the promise of spring. She stood in her hospital room, carefully folding the few possessions she'd accumulated during her stay. Soft sweaters Dolores had brought her, books Mason had selected to help pass the time, and a small journal filled with her thoughts and drawings of building layouts that had helped the investigation. "Ready to go home?" Dolores asked softly, standing in the doorway with a wheelchair as per hospital policy. Caroline hesitated for a moment, her hands clutching the small duffel bag. "Home," she repeated, testing the word. It had been so long since that word meant anything real to her. "It's a lovely townhouse," Dolores assured her, moving forward to help gather the last few items. 3 bedrooms, secure entrance, and a beautiful garden out back. I've already stocked the kitchen and set up your room exactly how we discussed. The townhouse was indeed everything Dolores had promised and more. Located in a quiet, gated community, it offered both security and serenity. Large windows filled the spaces with natural light, while state-of-the-art security systems provided peace of mind. The walls were painted in soft, calming colors, and comfortable furniture invited rest rather than hiding. Caroline walked slowly through each room, running her fingers along smooth surfaces, listening to the healthy hum of proper ventilation, and learning the natural creaks of a well-built home. In the kitchen, she found her favorite tea already arranged in a cabinet, along with simple, healthy foods she'd mentioned enjoying during her hospital stay. "This is overwhelming," she admitted, sinking into a plush armchair in the living room. "But in a good way." Dolores sat nearby, giving Caroline space while remaining a steady presence. "Take all the time you need to adjust. There's no rush here. This is your safe space to heal and grow stronger." Over the next few weeks, Caroline slowly established routines that helped ground her in this new reality. Morning tea in the garden, where butterflies danced among carefully tended flowers. Afternoon counseling sessions with trauma specialists. Evening walks with Dolores, gradually venturing further from the townhouse as her confidence grew. Mason visited regularly, always calling ahead and respecting her boundaries. He brought updates about the investigation's progress and, increasingly, news about a project that was becoming his passionate focus, the Whisper Initiative. "We're converting abandoned buildings into safe spaces," he explained one afternoon, spreading preliminary designs across her kitchen table. "Each location will be specifically designed with trauma survivors in mind. Private spaces, multiple exits, excellent security, and on-site counseling services." Caroline studied the plans intently, her fingers tracing the thoughtfully designed layouts. "You've included listening posts," she noticed, pointing to specific points in the blueprints. Mason nodded. "Areas where residents can safely orient themselves, hear the normal sounds of the building, and know they're secure. Your insights helped us understand how important that is." As the weeks passed, Caroline's strength returned, not just physically, but emotionally. She began contributing ideas to the Whisper Initiative, her unique perspective proving invaluable in creating truly trauma-informed spaces. Then came the day Mason and Detective Rios proposed something that made Caroline's heart race. They wanted her to be the initiative's spokesperson. "Your story could help so many others," Rios said gently during a meeting in Caroline's living room. "But only if you feel ready. There's no pressure here." Caroline wrapped her hands around her tea mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. What exactly would it involve? A televised announcement of the initiative. Mason explained, "Sharing as much or as little of your experience as you're comfortable with, helping others understand why these safe spaces are so crucial." After several days of careful consideration and long talks with Dolores, Caroline agreed. The preparation was intense, but handled with sensitivity to her needs. She worked with a trauma-informed public speaking coach, practiced her speech extensively, and helped shape the initiative's message of hope and healing. The day of the announcement arrived bright and clear. The press conference was held in the lobby of the first Whisper Initiative building, still under renovation, but already showing signs of its transformation. Carolyn stood backstage, smoothing her simple but elegant blue dress, her hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to do this," Mason reminded her, standing nearby with concern evident in his eyes. Carolyn took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, I do. Not for me. For the others still hiding, still afraid. They need to know there's hope." When she stepped up to the podium, cameras flashing seemed less threatening than she'd feared. She found Dolores's encouraging smile in the crowd, saw Detective Rios standing protectively at the back of the room, and felt Mason's steady presence behind her. "My name is Caroline Klein," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "And I survived because I learned to listen. I learned every sound, every vibration, every whisper that might mean danger or safety." She paused, gathering strength, but listening saved only my life. It was compassion that saved my soul. As she continued speaking, her voice grew stronger. She shared enough of her story to help others understand, while maintaining boundaries around her most private experiences. She explained how the Whisper Initiative would create spaces where survivors could heal, where they would never again need to hide in walls or fear the sounds around them. "These buildings will not just be shelters," she concluded, emotion making her voice tremble but not break. "They will be sanctuaries where whispers of fear transform into words of hope." The response was overwhelming, not just from the media but from survivors and advocacy groups who immediately recognized the initiative's potential. After the formal press conference, Carolyn found herself surrounded by support and understanding rather than the judgment she had feared. As the crowd thinned and the evening approached, Mason found her standing quietly by one of the building's large windows. "Would you like to see more of the renovation progress?" he offered. "Only if you're not too tired." Carolyn nodded, feeling surprisingly energized despite the emotional day. Together, they walked out into the cool evening breeze, making their way to Mason's car. "I never thought I'd be able to talk about it," she admitted as they drove. "But today it felt like turning poison into medicine." The renovation site was peaceful in the gathering dusk. Construction equipment stood silent, and the building's bones were clearly visible, old structure being transformed into new purpose. Caroline walked through the spaces, now able to appreciate how her painful knowledge was being used to create something beautiful and healing. They stopped in what would become the main common area, where the last rays of sunlight streamed through newly installed windows. Here, survivors would find community. Here, whispers would become strong voices. Here, healing would begin. Mason watched Caroline taking it all in, seeing not just what was, but what would be. The woman who had crawled out of his wall, broken and terrified, now stood tall in the fading light, her presence radiating quiet strength and purpose. She had transformed her trauma into hope for others, her whispers into wisdom. Mason pulled up to the newly completed Whisper Initiative safe house just as the morning sun crested the horizon. The two-story building radiated warmth, its brick facade softened by climbing ivy and window boxes filled with colorful flowers. It looked nothing like the stark corporate buildings where Caroline had once hidden. "Are you ready?" Mason asked gently, seeing Carolyn's hands clasped tightly in her lap. She nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The front walkway was lined with lavender, its gentle scent carrying on the morning breeze. Mason unlocked the front door, stepping back to let Caroline enter first. Sunlight streamed through large windows, casting warm patterns across polished hardwood floors. The entrance opened into a welcoming living space with comfortable couches in soft blues and greens. Local artists had donated uplifting paintings that adorned the walls. Landscapes, butterflies emerging from cocoons, birds in flight. "It's so open," Caroline whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the space. "So different from—" She trailed off, but Mason understood. They moved through the house together. The kitchen gleamed with new appliances, open shelving stocked with dishes and cookware. A dining room featured a long wooden table where survivors could share meals together. Each bedroom had been thoughtfully decorated to feel like a sanctuary, with cozy reading nooks and private bathrooms. "Look at all the light," Caroline marveled, running her hand along a windowsill. "No more dark corners. No more cold concrete." Mason watched her explore, seeing how far she'd come from the frightened woman who'd emerged from his wall. Her steps were confident now, her shoulders straight, though her eyes still held echoes of past pain. As they reached the end of the tour, Mason pulled something from his pocket, a small bronze key with delicate engraving. "This is for you," he said softly, placing it in her palm. "It opens the garden gate. This entire place exists because you had the courage to step out of the walls." Caroline traced her initials on the key's surface, tears filling her eyes. Without warning, she stepped forward and embraced Mason tightly. "You rebuilt my life," she whispered against his shoulder. Mason's voice was gentle as he replied, "No, Caroline, you rebuilt mine too." Together they stepped outside into the sunlit garden. Morning glory vines climbed the trellises, their purple blooms opening to greet the day. A stone path wound through beds of herbs and flowers, leading to a small fountain whose peaceful burbling filled the air. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun illuminate the garden. It was a moment that held both an ending and a beginning, a testament to how far they'd come, and a promise of limitless hope ahead. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.